and political independence of states as one of the basic principles of international law based on UN Charter and Final Act from Helsinki from 1975, which guarantees the right of states to inviolability of borders, just like it is committed to the preservation of sovereignty and integrity of its own territory. The Republic of Serbia, likewise, advocating respect for territorial integrity of other sovereign nations, and regardless of not agreeing with all formulation stated in resolution, will vote in favor of a resolution. I am obliged to point to PP 13 and remind that the first attack against a sovereign state on the soil of Europe after the Second World War took place not so long ago, in 1999, when 19 countries attacked, at that time, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, primarily Republic of Serbia, when there was no appropriate reaction of such distinguished institution to this flagrant violation of UN Charter, despite the fact they still suffer from consequence of severe violation of fundamental principles of international law by others. Serbia is not giving up these principles even today. The Republic of Serbia will continue to advocate termination of conflicts, expecting that the parties will invest additional efforts into reaching diplomatic solution and creating conditions for peace throughout dialogue. Serbia will provide all kinds of humanitarian aid to endangered Ukrainian citizens while remaining committed to peace and consistent respect for international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Serbia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us today clearly represents a prejudiced attitude based on political propaganda. It's a means of political pressure.
معدو مشروع القرار على
Those who prepared the draft resolution
موجهة ضد الاتحاد
incorporated an aggressive language against the Russian Federation to belittle its legitimate stand based on its security concerns and its right to protect its people from the threats to national Russian security. Belarus is also impacted by this draft resolution. This draft resolution represents a flagrant political hypocrisy. Had the US and its Western allies been serious in de-escalating the situation, they would have fulfilled the promises they undertook 3 decades ago, not to expand the EU and transform Ukraine into a continuous threat to the Russian Federation. And they should have pressured Ukraine to abide by Minsk and to stop the violations against the civilians in Donbass, let alone those countries' eagerness to supply Ukraine with heavy weaponry and missiles, encouraging volunteers to fight in Ukraine. This indicates the clear-cut desire of those countries for provocations and not for containment and de-escalation. This draft resolution coincides with huge media campaign to spread erroneous information and lies. It's not designed to find a clear-cut and real solution for the
لشيطنة
crisis,
الاتحاد الروسي وتشويه صورته.
rather to defame the Russian Federation.
إنه نص مليء بالثغرات
It is
وبعيد عن
a text
الموضوعية
that is full of loopholes
ويتجاهل الأسباب الحقيقية
and
الكامنة وراء
untruths.
إشعال
It
فتيل هذه
ignores
الأزمة.
the real reasons for the
السيد
escalation
الرئيس،
of tension and for the
إن
eruption
الذين
of hostilities.
يثيرون الحماسة اليوم بشأن الدفاع عن
Those
ميثاق الأمم
who
المتحدة
are eager to defend the Charter of
كان
the United
عليهم أن
Nations
يظهروا
now
نفس
today.
الحماسة
They should have
ضد
shown the
استمرار
same
إسرائيل باحتلال الأراضي العربية المحتلة
vis-à-vis Israel's continued occupation of
وضد
the
اعتداء
Arab
القوات
territories
التركية على سيادة
and
الأراضي
the
السورية.
aggression committed by the Turkish
وماذا
forces
عن انتهاك قوات
against
الولايات
our territory?
المتحدة
What about
الأمريكية
the US
بسيادة وسلامة
violations
الأراضي
of
السورية؟
the territorial integrity of our land,
السيدات
Syrian
والسادة،
territories?
إن رفض الجمهورية العربية السورية
Syria's
لسياسات الغرب في الهيمنة
rejection of Western
والتدخل في الشؤون
hegemonistic
الداخلية
policies
للدول الأعضاء
and interference in the internal affairs
وإشعال
of states,
وإطالة أمد الأزمات
prolongating
ونشر
crises,
الفوضى
promulgating and
وتكريس
spreading
الانتقائية
anarchy,
والازدواجية في المعايير
opting for double
وفرض الإجراءات
standards and
القسرية
selectivities,
الأحادية
imposing unilateral
يحتم
sanctions,
عليها رفض مشروع
make
القرار
it
هذا
necessary for
والتصويت
us
ضده.
to reject this draft resolution
شكراً
and
سيد
vote
الرئيس.
against it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, it is clear from the debate over the past 2 days that the membership of the United Nations is united in its call to end the war in Ukraine and return to diplomacy. St. Vincent and the Grenadines wishes to offer an explanation of its vote on the draft resolution before us today. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines will vote in favor of the draft resolution. We will vote in accordance with our steadfast commitment to upholding the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, which form the core of multilateralism and gave birth to our United Nations 76 years ago. It bears repeating, Mr. President, that these principles underscore respect for sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states and enjoin member states to refrain from the threat or the use of force in the conduct of their international relations. Our support for the draft resolution is rooted in our conviction that the strict adherence to international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, and the principles of peace, dialogue, and compromise for the preservation of humanity is not optional. As a small island developing state, full compliance with the bedrock principles of international law remains an existential issue. We take the floor again, Mr. President, to repeat our call for these principles to be applied consistently and upheld as universal truths instead of selective, uneven, and unpredictable tools to further great power ambition anywhere and by anyone. Historically, and in recent times, we have witnessed the naked hypocrisy, double standards, and cynical misapplication of international law, which we have condemned. Today, we strongly emphasize that our august assembly should apply the fundamental principles of our charter impartially, irrespective of the size, economic, and military power of the principles involved. Mr. President, in the midst of prevailing global challenges, such as the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, we simply cannot afford another conflict. War does not manage grievances. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, therefore, calls for an immediate ceasefire to avert further bloodshed, human suffering, and a global catastrophe, and to engage in peaceful dialogue to find a solution to this war post-haste. Today, we must unite for peace. Thank you, and peace profound to all.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote before the vote. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraph 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 by a two-thirds majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The two-thirds majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become the co-sponsors of A/ES-11/L11, Barbados and Cambodia. If any other country wish to co-sponsor A/ES-11/L1, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. There is nothing further, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. The result of The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 141, against 5, abstentions 35. Draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr.
السيد الرئيس،
President.
لقد
Mr.
صوتت
President,
تونس لصالح
Tunisia
القرار اليوم
voted
انتصارا
in favor
لمقاصد
of
ومبادئ
the
ميثاق
draft
الأمم
resolution in
المتحدة
support of the
التي
principles and
انبنت
values
عليها
of the
سياستنا
UN
الخارجية،
Charter on which our
وتأكيدا
foreign
لحرص
policy is
بلادنا
based.
على إنهاء
We would
الأزمة
like to
باستعمال
emphasize
الوسائل
that
السلمية
the
لفض
crisis
النزاعات
must be
التي تبقى السبيل
settled
الوحيد
by
والأمثل لوضع
peaceful
حد
means, which is
للتصعيد
the
والحيلولة دون
ideal
مزيد تدهور
solution to
الأوضاع وتفاقم
prevent
الأزمات
further
والمآسي
aggravation
الإنسانية.
of the situation and
لقد
further
شهد
human
العالم ما
tragedy.
يكفي من ويلات الحروب
The
والأزمات
world
بكل
witnessed
تداعياتها
so
المدمرة
many
على حياة الناس وعلى
grueling
السلم والأمن.
wars destructive to peace and security and the life of people. Our experience indicate that military options cannot solve any crisis. Dialogue and negotiations can settle all differences and finding compromises.
فالأزمة الحالية في
The
أوكرانيا
current crisis
في
in
وقت
Ukraine
بدأ العالم
comes at a
يتهيأ
time the
فيه
world
للتعافي من تداعيات جائحة
was getting
كوفيد
out of
والتأسيس لمرحلة
COVID-19
جديدة
and prepare
قوامها
itself for a
التعاون
new stage
والتضامن
based on
والانخراط
solidarity,
الفاعل
cooperation,
في تعزيز العمل
and
المتعدد الأطراف
effective
وتحقيق
engagement
أهداف
in
أجندتنا
multilateral
المشتركة.
action and achieving our
ونعتقد
common
أن
agenda.
العالم
We
لا
believe
يمكنه
that the
تحمل
world
مزيد من
cannot
الأزمات بهذا الحجم
undertake or
والخطورة،
cannot
ولذلك فإن
burden
تونس
itself by
التي استبشرت
further
بانخراط
crises.
الأطراف المعنية في الحوار والتفاوض
We encouraged
تجدد
the
دعوتها للمجموعة
engagement
الدولية
of the
من
parties
أجل
in
تضافر
peaceful
الجهود
negotiations,
وتكثيف
and we
المساعي
urge the international
لتشجيع هذه
community to
الأطراف على
intensify
مواصلة الاحتكام إلى
efforts to
المفاوضات بما
obligate
يساعد
these
على وقف العمليات
parties
العسكرية
to resort to
وحماية
negotiations in a
الأرواح
manner to
وتهيئة
cease
الظروف لإيجاد حل
hostilities
دائم
and to
لهذه
prepare the
الأزمة.
way for finding
وباعتبار
permanent
أن
solution.
الأمن والسلم الدوليين
Given the
كل
fact
لا
that
يتجزأ،
international peace and
فإن
security
تونس تدعو
are a
إلى
whole,
التعامل مع
Tunisia
مختلف
calls
القضايا
for
العادلة
dealing with
بمقياس
all
واحد
just
حتى تتمكن الشعوب من
questions
استرداد حقوقها
in one
المشروعة
standard so
وفقا
that peoples
للمرجعيات
can
الدولية
regain
وبناء
their
عالم
legitimate rights in
أكثر
accordance
عدلا
with
وسلاما
international
واستقرارا.
legitimacy
شكرا
to
سيد
build
الرئيس.
a more stable, more peaceful world. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Mr. President, Rwanda takes the floor to explain its position on the vote we just cast. Rwanda voted in favor of this resolution to firmly support that sovereignty, independence, and interior integrity of any country must be respected. We supported this resolution to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, military escalation should cease immediately and go for peaceful settlement of the crisis. The Russian Federation and Ukraine have the key to resolve this conflict. The external intervention will only worsen the situation. Mr. President, we fully support international efforts to de-escalate the war, including the efforts of the Secretary General in solving the crisis. We urge all concerned parties to demonstrate calm and seek a solution to the conflict through dialogue to ensure that civilians do not continue to pay the heaviest price. A lasting solution, Mr. President, will only be achieved through dialogue by both parties, taking into account the concerns of both sides. The current war does not guarantee that it will bring peace. Instead, it's likely to generate subsequent crises and human suffering. Rwanda also expresses serious concern with the extent of humanitarian devastation and peace and security challenges caused by the conflict. We are also concerned by the reports that Africans are being racially segregated and denied safe exit and admission to neighboring countries. We call on all those who are involved to allow unhindered evacuation without looking at the color of origin of anyone. Mr. President, the founding principles of the United Nations Charter is to live peacefully with each other, uphold the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states while considering the security interests of other countries. Diplomatic options present the better solution to the sustainable peace. We call for open dialogue and negotiations in good faith. Finally, Mr. President, Rwanda calls for a sincere commitment to the United Nations Charter and international order. The ongoing crisis poses a severe threat to international peace and security. We encourage concerned parties to give a chance to peace. We wish to underline that a long-lasting solution to the current crisis primarily lands and is in the hands of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Dialogue is the only option to resolve the current crisis. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Rwanda, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Thank
you, Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
乌克兰局势仍在急剧
there
变化，
continues to be dramatic changes of the
形势发
situation
展
in
令
Ukraine.
人痛心。
What is now unfolding is indeed
中方在乌
heart-wrenching.
克兰问题上的基
China's
本立
basic
场
position on
是
the
一
Ukraine
贯
issue is
明确的。
consistent and
我
unequivocal.
们始终主
We
张
always
尊
believe
重各
that
国主
all
权
countries'
和领土
sovereignty
完
and
整，
territorial integrity
根据联合
should be
国宪章
respected,
宗旨和原
and that
则
international
和平
disputes
解决
should be
国际
resolved
争端。
peacefully in accordance with the purposes
当
and
前最
principles
重
of the
要
UN
的
Charter.
是尽可
The
能
top
缓
priority
解
right
现
now
地局
is to
势，
ease the situation on the
避
ground
免
as
冲
much
突
as
升
possible
级，
and
甚至
prevent
失
the
控。
situation from escalating or
俄罗
even
斯
getting
同乌
out
克
of
兰
control.
已经举
Russia
行
and
首轮谈
Ukraine
判，
have already held their
尽
first
管
round
存
of
在分歧，
negotiations.
双
Despite
方
their
都表
differences,
现出
both
继续
sides
推
have
进
shown
谈
their
判的意
willingness
愿。
to continue the
我们对此
negotiations.
表示欢迎。
China welcomes this.
面对十分复
Faced
杂
with
敏
the
感的
highly
形势，
complex and sensitive
中方
situation,
再次呼吁
China
国际
once
社会
again calls on the
坚持
international
政治
community
解决的
to
大
stick
方
to
向，
the overall direction
为
of a
当事
political
方直接
settlement
对话谈
and
判
foster an
创造
enabling
有利
atmosphere
氛围
and
和
conditions
条件。
for direct dialogue and negotiations
主席先
between the
生，
parties concerned.
联合国和
Mr.
有关各
President,
方采取的任
Any
何行动
action taken by the United
都要
Nations
以
and the
地区
relevant
和平
parties
稳定为
should
重，
give priority to regional
以
peace
各
and
方普
stability
遍安全为
and
重，
the universal security of
为
all
紧张
parties,
局势降温、
and should
推
play a
动
positive
外
role
交
for
解决
de-escalation
起到
and
正面
diplomatic
作用。
solutions.
遗憾的是，
Regrettably,
刚才提交
the
本
draft
次紧急特
resolution
别人大表
submitted
决
to
的
this
这项决
emergency
议草
special
案，
session for vote
事先没有在
has
全体
not
会员国范
undergone
围内
full
进行
consultations
充分
with the
协
whole
商，
membership,
没有全
nor
面
does it
考
take
虑
into
当
full
前危机背
consideration
后的
the
历史
history
经纬
and the complexity
和
of the
复
current
杂
crisis.
矛盾，没有强
It
调
does not
安全
highlight
不可
the
分割
importance
原
of
则
the
的
principle
重
of
要性，
indivisible security,
也没有突出
or
推
the
动政治
urgency
解
of
决、
promoting political
加大外
settlement
交努
and
力的
stepping up
紧迫性。
diplomatic efforts.
这些
These
都与中
are
方
not
一
in
贯
line
坚
with
持的
China's
立场
consistent
主张
position.
不符。我们不得不对
Therefore,
决议草
we
案
had no
投了
choice
弃权票。
but to abstain in the voting.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
乌克兰危机的最
the
终
final
解决
settlement of the Ukraine
还
crisis
是要摒弃冷战
requires
思维，
abandoning the Cold War
摒弃
mentality,
以损害他国安全
abandoning
为
the
代价，
logic of
维
ensuring
护
one's
自
own
身安全
security
的
at
逻辑，
expense of others' security,
摒弃以
and
扩张
abandoning
军事
the
集团
approach of
谋求
seeking
地区
regional
安全
security
的
by
做法。
expanding military blocs.
要在重视
It is
和尊
important
重
to
各
give
国
full
合理安全
attention
关切
and
基础上，
respect to the legitimate
通过
security
谈判
concerns of
形
all
成
countries,
均衡、
and
有
on that
效、
basis
可持续
conduct
的
negotiations
欧洲
to
安全
put
机
in
制，
place a balanced, effective, and
一味
sustainable
施压
European
制裁，
security
制
mechanism,
造分裂
blindly
对抗，
exerting pressure and
只
imposing
会导
sanctions
致局
and
面
creating
更
the
加
confrontation will
使
only
危
further
及消极
complicate the
影响，
situation,
迅
result
速
in a
外溢，
rapid spillover of the
甚至
negative
波及
impact of
更
the
多国家。
crisis and affect even more countries.
我们呼吁国际社
We
会
call
本
on
着
the
负责
international
任态度，
community to take a
推动
responsible
有关各
approach,
方
promote the
尽快
relevant
回到
parties
政治
to
解决的
immediately
轨道
return
上
to
来，
the track of political
通
settlement
过对话协
and
商，
seek a
寻求
comprehensive
乌克兰
solution
问题
to
的
the
全
Ukraine
面
issue
解决。
through dialogue and
中方
consultation.
愿继续为
China
此
is
发
ready
挥
to
建
continue
设
its
性作用。
constructive role in this regard.
谢谢你，主席先生。
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, the delegation of Sierra Leone has requested for the floor to explain its position on the agenda item and vote on the resolution. The government of Sierra Leone is gravely concerned about the regrettable serious situation created in Ukraine with ramifications for regional and international peace and security. Sierra Leone also expresses serious concern over the growing refugee and humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, and particularly the safety and well-being of Sierra Leonean students in Ukraine. In appreciating efforts to provide the necessary safety and refuge, it is important for all those fleeing the conflict to be treated equally and with dignity, without discrimination, whether on the basis of race or status. A blanket denial is not the answer, nor representative of the values we seek to protect. Mr. President, Sierra Leone voted in favor of the resolution based on our fundamental belief in the sanctity of the United Nations Charter, its principles, and the purposes of the organization. Our vote today is not a selective application of our fundamental belief in the principles of sovereign equality of all UN member states, the territorial integrity or political independence of member states, non-interference, and the peaceful settlement of dispute. Our vote today is not to absolve the actions and inactions of the United Nations, particularly in addressing peace and security questions in Africa. While we believe that the United Nations must be consistent in the application of its charter and in pursuit of its purposes, resorting to the threat or use of force and the violation of the territorial integrity of any member state inconsistent with the charter must be rejected. Sierra Leone accordingly calls for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also call for the immediate cessation of hostilities, and in this regard, we welcome the commencement of ceasefire talks, and we urge for the continuation of the talks in a meaningful way. Finally, we also urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand has carefully considered the draft and voted in support of the resolution because of the overriding importance that Thailand attaches to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and those of international law, in particular, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the non-use of force against states. Our support of the resolution also underlines our deep concerns for the plight of affected civilians and the humanitarian consequences of the hostilities and violence in the area. In this regard, we call on all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. We are also concerned with the potential longer-term consequences on the rules-based international order and renew our call towards peace and for all parties to enhance dialogue through various means to truly realize a peaceful settlement of the situation. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, we recognize the exceptional circumstances we are all facing, and we share the conviction that the General Assembly could not remain silent. The resolution adopted this morning conveys a message, and Brazil has added its voice to that of other members. The adoption of this resolution by the General Assembly shows the unwavering commitment of the international community to upholding the core principles upon which the UN is built. We are appreciative of the attention given in different paragraphs of the text to the critical need to monitor and alleviate the humanitarian situation on the ground. We also welcome the text for urging the parties to the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law, to guarantee the safety of civilians, as well as of humanitarian and medical personnel, and to facilitate unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The resolution as adopted, however, does not go far enough in underscoring that the cessation of hostilities is only a first step to achieve peace. Sustainable peace needs additional steps. In this respect, it is regrettable that the supportive role of the United Nations, that the United Nations can and should play has been left by the wayside in the eagerness to point fingers. Yes, the resolution is a call for peace by the international community, but peace requires more than the silence of guns and the withdrawal of troops. The path to peace requires comprehensive work on the security concerns of the parties. The only precondition should be an immediate ceasefire. And Mr. President, the resolution cannot be seen as permissive towards the indiscriminate application of sanctions and the deployment of arms. These initiatives are not conducive to the proper resumption of a constructive diplomatic dialogue and risk further escalating tensions with unpredictable consequences to the region and beyond. We also have concerns about preambular paragraph 15. It is not constructive at this moment fraught with danger in this particular resolution to comment on military measures adopted by any specific nuclear power, be it the Russian Federation or the members of NATO. Once effective negotiations do get started, all the parties must show true flexibility and spirit of compromise. Lasting solutions can only be achieved at the negotiating table through committed dialogue. Brazil continues to urge all actors to de-escalate and to renew efforts in favor of a negotiated diplomatic agreement between Ukraine and Russia that contributes to the establishment of the security and the stability of the region. We stand ready to resolutely work in favor of peace in the discussions in this Assembly, in the Security Council, and in other fora. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. This emergency special session comes as the conflict in Ukraine has reached a dangerous inflection point. The international community is alarmed by developments on the ground, and this is the clear message of today's resounding vote. The humanitarian situation is worsening by the day. We have seen reports of rapidly growing civilian casualties and massive displacement, the extent of which Europe has not experienced in decades. The UAE is deeply concerned by these developments. Our collective responsibility must, however, be towards exhausting all efforts and using all diplomatic channels to prevent a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. We remain firm in that belief more than ever before. Yesterday, the UAE pledged $5 million in response to the UN's humanitarian flash appeal. We know that in the days, weeks, and months ahead, more must be done. The credibility of this organization, born out of the ashes of World War II, rests on its universal representation and its effectiveness in applying the principles that we all uphold. However, as this conflict has revealed, the clear and full voice of the United Nations has only grown harder to summon because it is not equally applied. Despite deepening divisions, now is time to take a step back, identify diplomatic off-ramps, and engage constructively to end this conflict. It is also a time to summon our reserves of wisdom and experience to guide the way forward. Global solidarity means doing more than focusing on conflicts in some parts of the world while ignoring others. We need to shift our mindset from conflict management to conflict resolution. Our collective security depends on it. Let this crisis be the wake-up call. The future of this organization may rest on that. We all need to galvanize UN efforts to promote the dialogue, work towards an end to the hostilities, and address the humanitarian situation for those most desperately in need. The UAE recognizes the need to meet this moment with renewed diplomacy and leadership, and put the needs of the people on the ground at the center of our efforts. The avenues for dialogue must, however, remain open more urgently than ever before, and we must pursue them together. Mr. President, right now we recognize that this resolution adopted here today is a necessary signal of where we need to be going. Resigning ourselves to a cycle of perpetual violence and sanctions that only adds to the suffering of civilians diminishes us all. We voted for this resolution, and we join with member states in making this appeal to peace, a just peace that endures by recognizing the legitimate concerns of all parties and also abides by the UN's charters of principles and independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity. This resolution, however, as others have said, is not enough for a sustainable peace. Resolution of this conflict requires dialogue and effective diplomacy. This text represents the determination of member states to respond to the conflict today in Ukraine. That is the call that rings clearly from this meeting. We must now turn to finding ways to bring about its peaceful resolution with full respect for and commitment to real and engaged diplomacy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India has been deeply concerned over the rapidly deteriorating situation in Ukraine and the ensuing humanitarian crisis. An Indian national was tragically killed in Kharkiv yesterday due to the ongoing hostilities. We express our deepest condolences to his family and to that of each and every innocent civilian who has lost his or her life in this conflict. We demand safe and uninterrupted passage for all Indian nationals, including our students who are still stranded in Ukraine, particularly from Kharkiv and other cities in the conflict zones. Many member states share this concern. We have reiterated this demand to both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. This remains our foremost priority. Ensuring the well-being and safety of our citizens is the basic duty of every government. We have therefore instituted special flights to bring back Indians home from conflict zones. My government has deployed senior ministers as special envoys to countries neighboring Ukraine to facilitate evacuation. We thank all neighboring countries of Ukraine for opening their borders and extending all facilities to our embassies at this time. India has already dispatched humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. This includes medicines, medical equipment, and other relief material. We are sending more such tranches in the coming days. India supports the international community's call for an immediate ceasefire. We also support safe humanitarian access to conflict zones. We remain firm in our conviction that differences can only be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi has unequivocally conveyed this in his discussions with world leaders, including of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. He underscored the urgent imperative for humanitarian access and movement of stranded civilians. We therefore sincerely hope that the second round of talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine will lead to a positive outcome. India urges that all member states demonstrate their commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, to international law, and respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Keeping in view the totality of the evolving situation, India decided to abstain. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. لقد صوتت بلادي
Thank you, President.
لصالح القرار المتضمن في الوثيقة
We voted in favor
A/ES-11/L1 انطلاقا من إيمانها الثابت بمبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقانون الدولي، لا سيما مبادئ حسن الجوار وحل النزاعات بالطرق السلمية واحترام السيادة والاستقلال والسلامة الإقليمية لجميع الدول. وتؤكد مملكة البحرين على دعمها لكافة الجهود الرامية إلى وقف العمليات العسكرية واللجوء إلى الحوار والوسائل الدبلوماسية. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
And use all diplomatic means necessary to achieve peace. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bahrain, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eritrea is taking the floor in explanation of vote after the vote on the draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. Eritrea firmly believes that respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, are sacrosanct principles and should be respected by everyone at all times for the attainment of sustainable world peace. Eritrea's vote is demonstration of its uncompromising stand for peace. Its position is against internationalizing, incessant rhetoric, and imposition of unilateral sanctions, which regrettably further polarize international relations and escalate the situation with enormous implications for civilians. Instead, we have consistently opted for world regions to be given the needed space and solidarity to address political problems. The situation between Russia and Ukraine raises serious concern with political, economic, and security ramifications for Europe and the rest of the world. It requires immediate resolution by giving more chance to diplomacy. We hope that the ongoing talks between the two parties on the Belarusian border yields a quick and acceptable agreement to stop the war and pave a foundation for peace in the region. Eritrea opposes all forms of unilateral sanctions as illegal and counterproductive. Eritrea, the country that has been subjected to such measures by the West for 2 decades, including new sets of unilateral measures, understands that sanctions do not resolve problems of peace and security. On the contrary, they only hurt innocent people and undermine the road to peace. It will be remiss if I don't address disturbing reports that African citizens living in Ukraine are facing difficulties to cross the borders. We call on all countries to facilitate safe passage to people fleeing for safety regardless of their racial identity. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating that, that Eritrea would like to see that the windows for diplomacy remain open. We are confident of the ability of the parties to resolve their differences and reach an outcome that meets the interests and concern of all. We hope that the international community constructively support the parties in their search for sustainable peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Eritrea, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran is following the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine with grave concern. We reiterate our principled position regarding the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and underline the need for full respect by all parties for the well-established provisions of the United Nations Charter, international law, including international humanitarian law. We emphasize that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be fully respected, and the safety and security of all civilians must be guaranteed. In order to find long-term and sustainable solutions to such crises, it is necessary to address their root causes. We note that the current complexities in the fragile region of Eastern Europe have been exacerbated by the provocative actions and decisions of the US and NATO. The security concerns of Russia must be respected. Wars and destructions inflicted on civilian lives and infrastructures are not acceptable, wherever they occur. The Islamic Republic of Iran calls for urgent cessation of hostilities and the escalation of tensions in the current conflict. In this regard, Iran underlines the essentiality of dialogue to address issues of concerns to all sides, leading to long-term results. The UN must always avoid double standards, particularly when it's considering issues related to the maintenance of international peace and security. It is unfortunate to note that the UN, in particular the Security Council, has at times neglected this principle, which has undermined its credibility. A case in point is the Security Council's handling of the conflict in Yemen. Mr. President, we believe that the text of the resolution before the General Assembly lacks impartiality and realistic mechanisms for resolving the crisis through peaceful means. Furthermore, not all member states of the UN were given the opportunity to engage in negotiations on the text of the resolution. It should be emphasized that the General Assembly is not in a position to determine the existence of an act of aggression because, in addition to Article 39 of the Charter, GA Resolution 3314 of 14 December 1974 calls on the Security Council to determine the existence of an act of aggression. Moreover, convening the emergency special session based on the General Assembly Resolution 377A shall not be considered as the end of the dialogue. My government continues to call for a comprehensive, peaceful, and sustained resolution to the current conflict, including an immediate ceasefire and a start of the dialogue, as well as provision of humanitarian assistance to the people in need. For the above-mentioned reasons, my delegation abstained from voting on the resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. تود مصر أن تؤكد على النقاط التالية اتصالا بالقرار الذي تم اعتماده للتو وصوتت مصر لصالحه انطلاقا من إيمانها الراسخ بقواعد القانون الدولي ومبادئ ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. واحد، إن البحث عن حل سياسي سريع لإنهاء الأزمة عبر الحوار وبالطرق السلمية ومن خلال دبلوماسية نشطة يجب أن يظل نصب أعيننا جميعا والهدف الأساسي للمجتمع الدولي بأسره في التعامل مع الأزمة الراهنة، ومن ثم يتعين إتاحة الحيز السياسي الكفيل بتحقيق ذلك الهدف الأساسي. اثنين، تؤكد مصر أنه لا ينبغي أن يتم غض الطرف عن بحث جذور ومسببات الأزمة الراهنة والتعامل معها بما يضمن نزع فتيل الأزمة وتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار. ثلاثة، ترفض مصر منهج توظيف العقوبات الاقتصادية
rejects
خارج
the
إطار
exploitation
آليات
of
النظام
economic
الدولي متعدد
sanctions
الأطراف
outside the
من
multilateral
منطلق
international
التجارب
mechanisms,
السابقة
because
والتي كان
previous
لها
experiences
آثارها
have shown
الإنسانية
that such
السلبية البالغة وما
sanctions can
أفضت
have dire
إليه من
humanitarian
تفاقم معاناة
consequences and
المدنيين
lead to
طوال العقود الماضية.
to escalating the
4.
sufferings of
من الواجب
civilians.
أن تتحلى كل
4.
بالمسؤولية
parties
الواجبة
should
لضمان
live up to their
تدفق المساعدات
responsibilities and
الإنسانية
guarantee
لكل
the flow
محتاج
of humanitarian
دون أي
assistance to all
تمييز
those in need
مع
without
كفالة
any
مرور
form of
المقيمين الأجانب
discrimination, and they should
بانسيابية
also
عبر الحدود
guarantee the free
حيث
movement
وردت بعض التقارير
of the
عن
residents
معاملات
across the borders,
تمييزية.
because we have had reports
5.
of discriminatory
تجدد
treatments in
مصر
that regard.
التحذير
5.
من مغبة الآثار
Egypt
الاقتصادية
warns of the
والاجتماعية
economic and
للأزمة
social
الراهنة
consequences
على
of the
الاقتصاد
current
العالمي
crisis on the
برمته
global economy.
والذي ما زال يعاني من
The global
تداعيات
economy
الجائحة
is still suffering
ولعل
the
الاضطراب
consequences
المتزايد
of the
في
pandemic
سلاسل الإمداد
and
وحركة
the
الطيران
disruption in the
الدولي
supply chains
لأبلغ
and the
دليل على
international
ذلك.
aviation is the best
إن
proof.
فاعلية
6.
ومصداقية
The
قدرة
effectiveness and
آليات العمل
credibility
الدولي
of the
متعدد الأطراف
international
في
multilateral
مواجهة
mechanisms in
التحديات
facing the
والأزمات
different crises
المتلاحقة
and
إنما
challenges
يعتمد على
depends
تناول كافة
on
الأزمات
how we deal with
الدولية
all the
وفقا
international crises
لمعايير واحدة
based on
وثابتة
the same standards
متسقة
and
مع
criteria
مبادئ
in
الميثاق
line with the UN
ومقاصده
Charter
دون
and
أن
its
تمر
objectives
عقود
without
يتم خلالها تكريس الأمر الواقع والمعاناة
consecrating the status
الإنسانية.
quo and
وشكراً
humanitarian
سيد الرئيس.
sufferings for decades, and thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to deliver the explanation of vote of my country, Algeria. في الوقت الذي يتابع فيه بلاد الجزائر
At a time when my
وبقلق
country
بالغ
Algeria is closely
تطور
following
الأوضاع
the
الخطيرة الراهنة
development
والمتصاعدة في
of the
أوكرانيا
situation and the escalation in
يود
Ukraine,
وفد بلادي التأكيد
my
مجددا
delegation would like to
تمسك
emphasize once
الجزائر
again that
الثابت
Algeria
بمبادئ
is
ومقاصد
committed
ميثاق
to
الأمم
the
المتحدة
principles and the
التي
objectives of the
يتعين أن
United
تبقى
Nations,
أساس القانون
which should
الدولي
remain the basis
وحجر
of
الزاوية في
international
العلاقات
law and a
الدولية
cornerstone in
لا سيما
international
تلك
relations,
المتعلقة
especially
باحترام استقلال
the
الدول
respect of
وسيادتها
the
وسلامة
independence,
أراضيها
sovereignty,
طبقا
and
للشرعية
territorial
الدولية
integrity of the member
وحق
states
الشعوب
according
في
to the
تقرير
international
مصيرها
legitimacy and the right of people
وانطلاقا
to
من
self-determination.
مواقفها المبدئية
And in line
فيما
with
يتعلق
our
بتعزيز النظام متعدد
positions
الأطراف
calling for
والحفاظ عليه
enhancing multilateralism and
وتماشيا مع
safeguarding it,
التزامها
and
بتطوير
also in
العلاقات
line with our
الودية بين
commitment
الدول
to developing
على أساس التعايش
amicable
السلمي
relationships
والتسوية
among
السلمية
countries
للنزاعات
based on peaceful
والاحترام
coexistence and peaceful
المتبادل
settlement of conflicts and
للالتزامات
the
الدولية
mutual respect of
والضمانات الأمنية
international commitments
لا
and
يمكن
security
لبلاد
guarantees.
الجزائر
My country,
إلا
Algeria,
الانضمام
can
إلى
only
كافة
join
الجهود
all the
والدعوات
other efforts
الدبلوماسية
and diplomatic
الهادفة إلى
calls
تخفيف
aiming
حدة
at
التوترات الحالية
de-escalating the current
وانتهاج
situation
فضائل الحوار
and
من أجل
adopting dialogue
إذكاء العيش
in
معا
order
في
to
سلام بين
foster
الدول
peaceful coexistence
حفاظا
among
على السلم
nations
والأمن
to safeguard
الدوليين.
international
Thank you,
peace
Mr.
and
President.
security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of United Republic of Tanzania.
Mr. President, the United Republic of Tanzania has decided to abstain this resolution as a matter of principle and in defense of the UN Charter. Fundamentally, this decision resulted from our inability to amend or make reservations to some provisions in the resolution. We were convinced that there was a need to adjust the draft resolution. The United Republic of Tanzania believes that diplomacy is the best way to end this conflict. To this end, we appeal to all parties to the dispute to uphold human rights and their obligations under international law and humanitarian law, to de-escalate the conflict and give peace a chance. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Republic of Tanzania, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we thank you for giving us the opportunity to take the floor to elaborate on South Africa's decision to abstain on today's resolution. Mr. President, let me reiterate our position expressed during the discussions of the emergency special session over the last few days. Firstly, by highlighting that South Africa remains deeply concerned by the escalation of conflict in Ukraine and the regional and international socio-economic implications. We strongly urge all sides to uphold international law, including humanitarian law and human rights law, as well as the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, the conflict involves two members of the United Nations in an armed conflict, which this organization has at its foundation the responsibility to prevent. The United Nations, therefore, must take decisions and actions that will lead to a constructive outcome conducive to the creation of sustainable peace between the parties. The resolution that we have considered today does not create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. While we agree with and support the efforts taken by member states to bring to the attention of the international community the situation in Ukraine, South Africa feels that greater attention should have been paid to bringing the sides closer to dialogue. For South Africa, the text in its current form could drive a deeper wedge between the parties rather than contributing to a resolution of conflict. The resolution should have welcomed the commencement of negotiations between the parties. Additionally, the role of the Security Council, as well as the good offices of the UN Secretary General, could have been given more prominence in the resolution. It is understood that one of the root causes of conflict is related to the security concerns of the parties. This should have been addressed in the resolution. Even though this emergency special session of the General Assembly is being held after the failure of the Security Council to address the matter, we believe that the Security Council should still be urged to play its role as mandated by the Charter to maintain international peace and security. South Africa believes that the UN, especially in the context of emergency special sessions, whose nature and significance speak to the gravity of the issues we bring before the international community, should be used as a platform to build bridges, address the divergence of views, provide recommendation and support for the parties to engage with a spirit of compromise, while de-escalating tensions, committing to the cessation of hostilities, and building trust and confidence. Unfortunately, the text before us did not do that. South Africa will have also preferred an open and transparent process to negotiate the resolution today. This would have allowed all of us, as equal members of the Assembly, to present our views and ideally reach a level of understanding before the text was tabled. As member states of the organization committed to global peace and development, we must continue to work together to promote peace. Gestures that merely create the impression of promoting peace without meaningful action will not assist. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Lebanon voted yes on this resolution because Lebanon, a founding member of the United Nations, believes in the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, especially the prohibition of the threat or use of force in international relations, the principle of non-intervention, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Mr. President, these are not merely slogans for Lebanon. We lived through invasions, occupation, intervention in Lebanon's internal affairs, and experienced devastation, loss, and pain that we are still enduring its consequences today. That's why our decision today was not taken lightly. We know what happens in wars, but we also know that wars happen not only when people fail to prevent them, but most importantly, when the voices of war drown the cries for peace. Lebanon, a peace-loving nation, enjoys a good relationship and friendships with all parties to this conflict, with Russia and Ukraine. And in this spirit, we call on everybody to go back to the logic of peace. Mr. President, yesterday, a European colleague told me he has never lived through war. I was happy for him. I lived through at least 2 invasions, a civil war, multiple assassinations, and explosions. That's why, Mr. President, I don't want anybody to live in what we lived through. It's time for diplomacy, for dialogue, and a peaceful resolution of this conflict. I hope that all my colleagues here in this GA hall will put the same energy and commitment that was put to make this vote and its result a reality, to start working for a peaceful resolution that takes both sides' concerns and interests into consideration, so the world will step away from this abyss of war. Mr. President, the preamble of the United Nations Charter tells us, quote, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security. Now we need this unity. Unity for peace. The United Nations is well positioned to step up and step in to make this peace a reality. Now we need to stop the escalation in words and deeds and help both sides to take the path of peace for the sake, not only the 2 sides, but for the sake of our world. Mr. President, we in the Middle East are very concerned about this war because of its impact on Europe, but also because we know from experience what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. That the last 2 world wars left deep scars in our part of the world, obliterated countries and hopes, and we are still living its aftermath today. I hope, Mr. President, we all learn the lessons of the last wars, and I hope that from this moment we start working only for peace. Peace in our time, peace in all time, as a former president of the United States said. Mr. President, I agree with Albert Camus in his speech upon receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature in 1957, that probably, and as a quote, every generation sees itself as charged with remaking the world. Mine, however, knows that it will not remake the world, but its task is perhaps even greater, for it consists in keeping the world from destroying itself. This is the same responsibility bestowed on us as the Charter instructed us to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, as a member of the family of nations, Malaysia is committed to the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations and the ideals it espouses. We reiterate the inviolability of the fundamental principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country, and peaceful settlement of disputes in the maintenance of international peace and security, as well as global prosperity. All parties must uphold these fundamental and sacrosanct principles of the UN Charter and international law that guide the conduct of friendly relations between nations and peaceful coexistence. Many will agree that the resolution before us is far from perfect. While my delegation continues to have concerns with some of the language contained in the resolution, Malaysia voted in favor of it as a matter of principle and out of our strong conviction of the aforementioned principles. Mr. President, Malaysia values its strong and close relation with Ukraine and Russia. We believe the differences and legitimate security concerns of both parties, given the complex geopolitical context must be addressed through dialogue and peaceful means in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter and rule of law. In this context, we welcome the direct talks held between Russia and Ukraine in Belarus and urge both sides to continue on the peaceful path to prevent further loss of life and destruction. From the vivid discussion at this emergency special session, what stood out glaringly to us as an overwhelming desire for the current conflict to be peacefully resolved. The General Assembly has spoken with a clear and fervent voice on the matter today. Now, more than ever, the Security Council has to live up to its primary responsibility as the custodian of international peace and security. Malaysia calls on the Security Council to spare no effort in resolving this conflict. Mr. President, the future of humanity is at a precipice. Humanity must prevail, and peace is the only answer. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my delegation is distressed by the ongoing violence and conflict in Ukraine. Conflict anywhere inflicts stress everywhere. Nepal is a peace-loving country, as its soil is consecrated by the birth of Lord Buddha, an apostle of peace. For us, values of peace, harmony, and peaceful coexistence are our way of life, so they are supremely precious. Norms of world peace, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-aggression as enshrined in the UN Charter are the fundamentals of our foreign policy. The use of force against Ukraine goes contrary to these values and principles. Nepal opposes this violation of international law and the principles of UN Charter. Mr. President, there is no alternative to diplomacy and dialogue, to building peace and sustaining it. Nepal welcomes the second round of talk between Russia and Ukraine. We urge both sides to continue the dialogue with utmost sincerity and integrity to resolve this conflict peacefully and find a lasting political solution for their enduring peace and peace for the Europe. Based on Nepal's principled position on the inviolability of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of any state under international law, rules-based international order, and United Nations Charter, my delegation has voted yes on the draft resolution that was before us today. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nepal, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
طلبنا المشاركة في إبداء تعليل إعلان التصويت
We have
بعد التصويت.
requested the floor to justify our vote.
صوت العراق بالامتناع على القرار المعتمد أمامنا هذا اليوم
in this vote
والمرقم
on resolution A/ES-11/L1.
يأسف العراق لتدهور
Iraq
الأوضاع
regrets
والتوتر
the
الحاصل
deterioration of the situation
بين
and the
الاتحاد
escalating
الروسي
tensions
وأوكرانيا.
between the Russian Federation and
ويدعو جميع
Ukraine.
الأطراف
And
إلى
Iraq
حل
calls
الأزمة
upon all parties to settle this
بلغة
conflict
الحوار
by giving priority to
الوسائل
dialogue and
الدبلوماسية.
through the diplomatic means.
والركون إلى طاولة المفاوضات
And we invite them to go back to negotiations in order to solve
وبما
their
يسهم في الحفاظ على
concerns
السلم
and in order
والأمن
to
الدوليين
safeguard international peace and security
وعدم تعريض الدول إلى
and
أزمات
not
اقتصادية
to
وأمنية من
threaten the
جراء هذه
world
الأزمة
with economic and political
حيث
crises
يعبر
resulting
العراق
from this
عن
situation.
القلق البالغ
Iraq expresses
من
its grave
إمكانية
concern
استغلال
over
الإرهابيين
the possibility
لهذه
for
الأزمة
the terrorists of
وحالة
exploiting
الانقسام
this crisis
المتوقعة
and
في
the
المجتمع
expected
الدولي
division in the international
بما
community.
يعطل
This would hinder the international efforts and our joint endeavors aiming at preventing terrorism and violent extremism. Iraq has decided to abstain because of our historical background in Iraq and because of our sufferings resulting from the continuing wars against our peoples. Iraq, and in principle, does not support wars as a settlement mechanism. And we reiterate that all conflicts should be settled peacefully in order to safeguard the lives of civilians. Iraq calls upon all parties to uphold the UN Charter and international law and emphasizes the necessity of safeguarding the security and safety of the international staff and the humanitarian workers. And thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iraq, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
لقد صوت
الأردن لصالح مشروع القرار الذي تم اعتماده الآن تأكيداً على سيادة الدول وسلامتها الإقليمية واستقلالها السياسي وعلى محورية تحريم استخدام القوة في العلاقات الدولية وبما يخالف أحكام القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة. يأمل الأردن أن يتم العمل على نزع فتيل النزاع والوصول إلى
tensions in order to reach a peaceful settlement of this conflict, and that both parties will sit together on the negotiation table in order to reach such a peaceful settlement. We also hope that international efforts will be intensified on both the political and diplomatic levels to assist the parties to end this crisis, and in order to avoid the dire consequences that have arisen and could arise out of this conflict. And we would like to reiterate that all parties, and I insist all parties, should respect the international humanitarian law, human rights, and the international refuge law without any discrimination. To conclude, Jordan would like to remind of the necessity of respecting the international law provisions and the UN Charter, whereas force should not be used against other countries and peoples, and should not be used against the right to self-determination, and that a single standard should be implemented regardless of the region concerned and without any discrimination in implementing international criteria and standards. And we hope that this would lead to an effective dialogue inside the organization in order to implement this approach and to assess the current approach and to reach our common goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jordan. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote after the vote. We will now hear statements after the adoption of the resolution. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues, last week the UN Security Council was prevented to act against Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression on Ukraine because of one isolated vote, that of the Russian Federation. Immediately after that, we initiated work to ensure that this body, where the countries of the world can all speak up, lives up to its responsibility. Over the past few days, the European Union has worked hand in hand with Ukraine and countries from all parts of the world to prepare the resolution just adopted. We thank all countries that have supported it. The decision is clear. The world has spoken. The Russian government must immediately stop the aggression, withdraw its troops, and abide by the rules of the UN Charter that applies to all equally. Over the past days, the brutality of Russia's invasion with the complicity of Belarus has reached unimaginable levels, with indiscriminate attacks against Ukrainian cities causing death and destruction among civilians in complete disregard of international law. Distinguished colleagues and friends, this is not just about Ukraine. This is not just about Europe. This is about defending an international order based on rules we have all signed up to, the sovereign equality of all states, large and small. This is about whether we choose tanks and missiles or dialogue and diplomacy. Today's historic vote clearly shows Russia's isolation from the rest of the international community. By voting overwhelmingly in favor of the resolution, we have chosen to defend peace where Russia has chosen brutal aggression. We have chosen to defend this organization and its charter where Russia has violated the fundamentals of both. Russia stands increasingly alone. The European Union and the world stand with the Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. Mr. President, from all corners of the world we have come together to send a resounding yes to uphold international law and the UN Charter, a resounding yes to the principle of the sovereign equality of all UN member states, a resounding yes to the need to respect the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of all UN member states, a resounding message to Ukraine and all Ukrainians. In the words of a colleague who spoke yesterday, you are not alone. We stand with you today, tomorrow, and until peace prevails and Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity are fully restored and respected. We have also sent a clear message to Russia and to Belarus. Stop the aggression now. Full stop. What you are doing is unacceptable. It is wrong. Your unprovoked aggression against Ukraine is a violation of the core principles that you signed up to when you laid the foundation of this very organization, of this community of nations. Your invasion of Ukraine deserves our strongest condemnation. You will be held accountable, and every legal avenue available must and will be used to hold the aggressor to account. You must stop the war immediately. You must return your troops to Russia. You must return to the path of peace, of genuine dialogue. It is not too late to stop. It is not too late to reverse the course. It is not too late for you to return to this community where we believe, with all our faults and imperfections, in the principle of the sovereign equality of all. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by the grave unfolding humanitarian crisis. We demand that all parties fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, protect civilians and critical civilian infrastructure, and ensure the safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access and passage. Humanitarian and medical personnel, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities, must be protected. Mr. President, thousands of civilians have been killed, more have been injured, and close to 1 million innocent civilians have been forced to flee across borders. Even more have been internally displaced inside Ukraine. They are in need of help and assistance, without delay, without hindrance and preconditions. And we take this opportunity to salute and express our deepest respect, appreciation, and admiration for the generous assistance and protection that Ukraine's neighbors have shown to all those fleeing the conflict, men, women, and children from all corners of the world. Once again, we conclude by echoing the words of a peaceful protester who had written on her sign, "If Russia stops fighting, there will be no more war. If Ukrainians stop fighting, there will be no more Ukraine." I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank you for convening this historic emergency special session of the General Assembly, a session that was called because the Security Council failed once again to fulfill its primary responsibility. A session that was convened due to the unjustified, illegal, and illegitimate act of aggression against a founding member of the United Nations by a permanent member of the very organ entrusted by the entire membership with preserving peace and security. A session that was held as a result of the use of veto power by the very member that's perpetrating the aggression. Mr. President, we are obliged to reiterate Russia's ongoing military offensive against Ukraine blatantly violates the fundamental rules of international law and the principles on which this august organization was founded. Rules and principles that aim to prevent wars and protect mankind from disastrous consequences. Consequences that we are unfortunately witnessing in and around Ukraine due to Russia's attacks. The international community could not have been as spectators to such an act of aggression. I am proud that as of today, it is not. With today's resolution, the United Nations emphasizes loud and clear that it stands against egregious violations of the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political unity of fellow member states. The membership is committed to preserving the letter and spirit of the fundamental constitutional document of our organization, the Charter. By adopting this resolution, the most democratic institution of the multilateral system denounces in the strongest possible terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We applaud the member states who contributed to the collective endeavor that culminated in today's outcome. You have stood firm in upholding full respect for the UN Charter and preserving the rules-based international order. We hope and trust that the calls and demands in this historic resolution will not fall on deaf ears. This body must follow through with its decision. Once again, we call on Russia to hear the demands of the global community and heed its own people's pleas to stop its military operations, withdraw all its forces from Ukraine, reverse its decision regarding the areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine and its annexation of Crimea, and return to diplomacy and dialogue without delay. We also reiterate our call for an immediate humanitarian pause. The peoples of the world hold their breath and wait with hope to see the march to the precipice halt. It is still not too late to go back to the negotiating table with serious engagement. Mr. President, as a neighbor and friend of both the Russian and the Ukrainian people, Turkey stands ready to facilitate the peaceful settlement of the conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. We still have 9 more countries member states who wish to speak. Therefore, we have heard the last speaker in statements after adoption. For this meeting, we shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon in this hall at 3 p.m. The meeting is adjourned.